Привет всем, как дела, and welcome back to the channel. Y'all saw the title, y'all know what this is. This is an overview of the Russian language. There's a lot to discuss in this video, so let's go. To start off, it's the time to see where the language came from. Russian, or Rусский, is an East Slavic language in the Indo-European language family. In fact, the most accepted theory as the Ulhaimat of the Indo-European languages is the Pontic-Caspian steppe, which is mostly in modern-day southwestern Russia. Not like the country has an advantage or anything. Russian evolved from Proto-Balto-Slavic and then Proto-Slavic, which was spoken between the 100s BC and the 500s AD by the common ancestors of the Slavs in what's now Belarus. At that point, the Slavic expansions happened, and during this time the ancestors of the Russians went east. Kievan Rus was established in 879, and those people spoke Old East Slavic while writing in Old Church Slavonic. Kievan Rus got conquered by the Mongols in the 1200s, just like most other places. Sometime during this is when Russian split off from the other East Slavic languages. From the 1400s to the 1600s was known as the Moscow period, and the borrowings from them came from German or Polish, as well as a lot of native coinages. Following that was Peter the Great's westernization push in the 1700s, where words relating to sciences and such were borrowed from Latin, French, German, and Greek. This culminated in the Russian Empire as well, which spread the language geographically along with the terror to indigenous people, unfortunately. The borrowings from the aforementioned sources continued into the 1900s when the Russian Empire became this place you may have heard of called the Soviet Union. After the fall of the Union in 1991, Russian stuck around to some extent in the non-Russian ex-Soviet countries, largely due to Russians living there. Today, Russian has some sort of official status in 11 countries, although 2 of them are the Georgian breakaway states, and is a recognized minority language in 15 countries. It's the national language of Russia, the largest country in the world by land area. In population, Russian has about 154 million native speakers, with 104 million second language speakers, totaling around 258 million total speakers. It has the 7th most native speakers and the 8th most total speakers in the world. We've learned how Russian forms, so now it's time to hear how Russian sounds. In terms of the phoneme count, it's a bit disputed. At the lowest, Russian has 6 vowels, done with allophones, and 21 consonants, totaling 27 phonemes and 31 allophones. However, other people say that the Russian consonant count is actually 34. Why such a large difference? Palatalization. Palatalization is when you pronounce a consonant closer to the palate than normal, or as some people call it, the ye. 13 of the Russian consonants can get palatalized, and it does make a difference in meaning. Some people consider the palatalized consonants separate phonemes, while others consider them the same sound with the palatalization as a suprasegmental feature. Now, in terms of less common consonants that Russian has, some of them are the palatalized consonants, which can sound very distinct from their unpalatalized counterparts, such as the voiceless alveolar palatalized plosive ch, and the same thing but voiced j. They're respectively distinct from ch, which is another Russian phoneme, and j, which doesn't naturally exist in Russian. Another rare consonant is the sound commonly transcribed like it says sh, but it's actually the voiceless retroflex fricative sh, along with its voice counterpart zh. There's also the harsh voiceless alveolopalatal fricative sh. Russian consonants have 2 allophonic variations. First, if a voice plosive or fricative is at the end of a word, it loses its voice like in snek and ostrov. The other one is that g becomes ch when in vowel g consonant position. Now on to vowels. The main vowel that learners of Russian struggle with is the high, central, unrounded tense vowel I, which is phonemic. However, the important topic regarding Russian vowels is reduction. Russian is a reductive language, and the system varies for each vowel phoneme. To start, there are 2 types of reduction in Russian. There's the syllable immediately before the stress, known as the first pretonic, and any other unstressed syllable. Reduction in the first pretonic tends to be less extreme than it is elsewhere. For the vowels, U gets slightly reduced to U in any unstressed syllable, while I and E, which are almost always preceded by a palatalized consonant, more on that later, get reduced to I, except for word final E. I doesn't get reduced. For a and o, the pretonic business matters, as they both get reduced to a in the first pretonic syllable, or if they're the first sound, not syllable, sound in a word, and in other unstressed syllables. For some examples of Russian reduction, rubashka, везение, хорошо, гостиная, and радость. Unfortunately for learners, Russian has mobile stress, meaning that the position of the stress doesn't have any universal pattern. Now we get to Russian orthography. An important thing to be aware of is that this writing system is not hard. People are always like, Russian seems impossible to read, or reading it has gotta be the hardest part of learning Russian. None of that is true. Russian is written in its version of the Cyrillic alphabet. Russian uses 33 letters with 21 consonant characters, 10 vowel characters, and 2 special characters. The consonants are pretty straightforward, they all represent one phoneme. Now, you may have noticed that the number of vowel characters is almost twice the number of phonetic vowels. This is some absolute genius work, and here's why. Rather than making almost double the number of consonants in order to reflect palatalization, St. Cyril did the smart thing. He attached it to the vowels. There are 2 sets of vowel characters, one without the y and one with it. If you're wondering why the E character is a palatalizer, it's because it can be said in different situations as either E or Y. The vowels for palatalization are also used for any syllable initial y's in native words, while the actual y letter, known as ikratke, is used in final positions in loanwords, although I wouldn't see an issue spelling yogurt like yogurt, just saying. Anyway, the Russian script has two special characters, also known as sign, mягкий знак and tвердый знак. Mягкий знак, or the soft sign, is the much more common of the two, and it indicates that the consonant before it is palatalized, especially at the ends of words, when they can't use the vowel to represent that. The other one, tвердый знак, meaning the hard sign, indicates that even though the spelling without it would indicate palatalization, the consonant before it is unpalatalized. For example, this word isn't pronounced shisht, but sjesht, with a two-consonant cluster. About yo, it can be problematic, as the diaresis is commonly omitted in writing, so many times learners can think that it's ye, but it's not. However, if you do see it, it's automatically the stressed syllable. The Cyrillic script does have capitalization for sentences and names. Now I'll take a look at whatever there is of Russian sentence structure. The default word order in Russian is SVO, but due to Russian grammar, which we'll talk more about later, the order of words is generally flexible. The most common way this is used is in SOV sentences, which are generally formed when the object is a pronoun. For this, let's look at a very basic sentence. Я вижу тебя в зеркале. Here we have subject, verb, object, rest of sentence. However, the sentence could just as easily be Я тебя вижу в зеркале. A bunch of other combinations can also happen. In fact, you don't even need ya. Russian is grammatically a pro-drop language as long as the verb isn't past tense. However, in reality, of all the pro-drop languages I know, Russians tend to drop the subject by far the least of any of them. They still can, though. Anyway, there are other parts of Russian sentence structure that can't be messed with. For one thing, as seen in the sentence, prepositions have to go before their nouns. That can't be messed with. In addition, adjectives have to go before their nouns, while genitive supplemental nouns have to go after the main noun. Continuing on with the grammar, now we get to articles. Okay then. Yeah, Russian doesn't have articles. As you're about to see, this is one of the only bones that Russian throws to learners. Anyway, let's talk about nouns. Russian nouns are inflected for two numbers, singular and plural, and are split into three genders, masculine, feminine, and neuter. The gender of Russian nouns is fairly easy to determine with the vast majority of them. The feminine nouns end in a or ya, like grazа and земля, while the neuter nouns end in o or ye, like озеро and море, whereas masculine nouns end in a consonant, like орел and свет. However, nouns ending in мягкий знак can be either masculine or feminine, but not neuter. These you just have to learn individually, like how день and огонь are masculine, but ночь and возможность are feminine. There are also a few irregularly gendered nouns, mostly ending with a or ya while not being feminine, like дядя, masculine, and время, neuter. Now what I've been waiting to talk about for a while. Let's look into the Russian noun cases. For those unfamiliar, a noun case is an inflection made on a noun based on its role in the sentence. Russian nouns are inflected for 6 cases: nominative, accusative, genitive, dative, instrumental, and prepositional. The nominative case is pretty easy to understand. It's the subject of the sentence, and this is the form that dictionaries will show. The accusative case is the direct object of the sentence or the destination of a verb of motion, more on that later. The genitive case is used for the possessor of another noun, or with these prepositions. It merged with the PIE ablative case, so a lot of the prepositions that govern the genitive case describe movement away from something or talk about the absence of something. The dative case is used for the indirect object and with these prepositions. The instrumental case is used with these prepositions or without a preposition to denote a tool that gets used, hence the name instrumental. Finally, the prepositional case, also sometimes called the locative case, is used with these prepositions, and here's where we talk about the verbs of motion along with these prepositions, v and na in particular. When there's a verb of motion in Russian, the destination and the location both take one of these two prepositions, which one depends on if it's in open space or not, but which role it has is determined by the case. The location is in the prepositional case, while the destination is in the accusative case. The prepositional case can also be used without a verb of motion, by the way. Anyway, so now how do we make these cases? I'll start with the nominative because it gives me the chance to explain pluralization as well, which I hadn't already done. To pluralize a masculine or feminine noun in the nominative case, drop the a or ya ending if feminine, and then add ö if the last consonant is unpalatalized, but if it's palatalized or ends in one of these letters, add i. For example, we have самолет to самолеты, занавес to занавесы, and птица to птицы. But медведь to медведи, лошадь to лошади, and утка to утки. To pluralize neuter nouns in the nominative case, either change the final o to a or the ye to ya. For example, there's облако to облака and кольцо to кольца, and направление to направление. However, those are just the rules. It's important to be aware of irregular plurals. 3 common examples to sum up the types of irregulars that there are: друг to друзья, дочь to дочери, and дерево to деревья. Now about the other cases and their plurals. Luckily, the plurals tend to all be the same regardless of gender, so that makes us only have to look at 4 ways to do the case charts rather than 6. Also, it should be mentioned that while 6 cases sounds scary, there's a bit of overlap for the morphemes, which makes it a bit more manageable. To really start, here's the accusative case. With masculine nouns, it's complicated as which form it takes depends on the animacy of the noun. Russian isn't overall a language where noun classes based on animacy are a thing, but they matter here. Basically, in Russian, animate nouns are anything referring to people or animals, and inanimate nouns are anything else. It's not hard to figure out. Inanimate masculine nouns in the accusative case are identical to the nominative case, while animate masculine nouns in the accusative are identical to the genitive case, which we'll get to in a minute. I would have said the same thing about the feminine nouns, but they're the only group that has a distinct accusative form. You take off the a and change it to u and ya to yu. Feminine nouns ending with mягкий знак in the nominative don't change in the accusative, even if they're animate. Neuter nouns in the accusative case are easy, just don't do anything, even if it's animate. However, animacy always matters in the plural, where it's pretty much just like the masculine agreement, inanimate looks like nominative, animate looks like genitive. Now let's actually figure out how to make that genitive. In masculine nouns, you add a to the end, same with the neuter nouns, but you remove the vowel at the end first. Genitive feminine nouns are formed just like the nominative plural, with the e or I. Forming genitive plural nouns is a bit of a headache. It depends mostly on how the nominative singular looks, but if the nominative plural is irregular, then the genitive plural will match that energy. Anyway, the easiest formation. If the noun ends in a vowel, then for the genitive plural you drop the vowel, and that's it. Unless there's an illegal consonant cluster ending the word, in which case you'll need an epenthetic vowel to split them up. Yes, in surprising news, there are consonant clusters that Russian phonology doesn't allow. Who would have thought? This is a group we can also possibly count these nouns into, even though they end in vowels. It's the palatalization talking. Anyway, if it ends in mягкий знак, or it's masculine and ends in one of these letters, the suffix is ye. Finally, masculine nouns have the genitive plural ending of, but yif if the last letter is ts. Now I can explain how to make the less convoluted cases. For masculine and neuter nouns, the dative case ends with u, the instrumental case ends with and the prepositional case ends with ye. For feminine nouns, the dative and prepositional cases both end in ye, while the instrumental case ends with oy. For plural nouns, the dative suffix is am, instrumental is amye, and prepositional is ach. Of course, always remember to change the a to ya and o to ye if the last consonant before it is palatalized. Hopefully that's all that needs to be said about Russian nouns. Now let's talk about some pronouns. Russian pronouns, as expected, agree with the case they need to be in, but there are a lot of repeated morphemes, which is a huge relief. Since we're dealing with a lot of pronouns, rather than just showing them on the conjugation chart like I've done in the past, I'll give them their own chart here. One thing you may notice is that the different categories of third-person pronouns exactly reflect the different noun classes that were just talked about. In the nominative, there's masculine on, feminine ana, and neuter ano, but only one plural pronoun, ani. Anyway, in terms of other cases, the accusative and genitive are always identical in pronouns, even for it. Something important to know about this pronoun is that despite its spelling, it's pronounced yivo, with a v, not a g. Also, for any third-person pronouns that start with a vowel, if they're preceded by a preposition, then n gets added to the front. As far as honorific pronouns go, v and all its inflected forms can be used as a singular pronoun in place of t and all its inflected forms for more respect. Continuing on, Russian uses pronouns for possession, and they're inflected for gender, number, and case, although they do resemble the inflections that adjectives take, which we'll get to in a minute. Here, for example, are all the ways to say my in Russian, also known as the first-person singular possessive pronouns. Here are the ones for second person, which are pretty much the same except for the consonants at the beginning. There are also these reflexive possessives, which just means that the possessor is the same as the subject. By the way, these are the other reflexive pronouns. Back to the possessives, here are the first and second person plural ones. Wondering how I haven't mentioned the third-person possessive pronouns? Congratulations, they don't get inflected, and they're exactly the same as their respective genitive pronouns. His and its are always yivo, her is always yiyo, and there is always ich. Now for a section I felt like was necessary because of both the correction video and what I know about Russian, numbers. Numbers in Russian, like adjectives, come before their nouns, but what they do to their nouns is weird. If a number ends in 1, then the noun is singular. If a number ends in 2 through 4, the noun is still singular but in the genitive case. And if a number ends in any other digit, the noun is in the plural genitive. Sound confusing? It gets worse, as that's only the case in nominative or accusative noun phrases. Otherwise, the number and the noun and any adjectives that may be there get inflected for the case that they need. Also, across languages, you'll notice that numbers stop getting inflected for whatever they get inflected for past a certain point. Not in Russian. While it's true that only 1, один, and 2, dva, get inflected for gender, all numbers get inflected for case up through infinity. This is only slightly relieved by the fact that numbers are predictable just as a fact of using any base system, and that numbers 5 through 10 end in mягкий знак, which means that their genitive, dative, and prepositional forms all end in i, and the only odd one out is the instrumental form, which ends in yu. The rest of the numbers through 99 follow pretty much the same pattern except for the sorek, which just becomes saraka in every case except nominative and accusative. Now let's actually talk about adjectives. All adjectives in Russian have distinct endings, one of three types. We'll look at the dictionary form, which is of course masculine singular nominative. The three endings are I, and oi. The first two are more or less similar, just the second one being for palatalized consonants, although it's not that simple, because if the final letter of the root is one of these, then the masculine singular nominative form is with I, but most other inflected forms look like they have I. The significance of the oi class is that those adjectives are always stressed on the last syllable, unlike the others which aren't. Anyway, y'all can see the rest of the forms. Of course, Russian adjectives are inflected for case as well as gender and number. The inflections look like this. Here are some things to notice. The animate-inanimate divide on the masculine and plural accusative forms applies to adjectives as well, while the feminine accusative is still doing its own thing, which looks similar to the noun in fact, with the uyu suffix. Also, the feminine adjectives really help us out by having the rest of their inflections identical. All of them are oi or ye. The other important thing to note here on the masculine and neuter genitive adjectives is that the avo and yivo suffix, like the pronoun yivo, is pronounced with v even though it's spelled with ge. Adjectives have other forms besides these, though. For one thing, if an adjective is in the predicative position, as opposed to the attributive, what we were just talking about, then it takes a different form, although still inflected for gender and number. The predicative form, more commonly known for Russian as the short form, is fairly easy to make. You just take the root and add one letter to the end, or not, if the noun is masculine. An example of the long and short forms, for more clarification, is znetoy vrach, busy doctor, versus vrach zanyet, the doctor is busy. Of course, it's not that easy, as adjectives with these endings don't have short forms, and neither do these two common adjectives, which use different words in their short forms. Russian adverbs, by the way, are formed with o following the root, just like the neuter short form. Adverbs are fairly frequent in Russian, as they also appear alone in impersonal phrases. Russian adjectives also have comparative inflections, which aren't inflected any further. Add ye to the end of the root to create them. There are also irregular comparatives to learn, like these. Now we go into another super complicated section, Russian verbs. The first thing you need to know about them is that for every verb, Russian has two verbs which represent different aspects. Aspect is a category of verb conjugation that tells the duration of the verb. The two aspects that Russian has are imperfective and perfective. Imperfective, whose infinitive people tend to consider the default, means that the verb is, was, or will be ongoing or habitual, while perfective means that a verb has a clearly defined start and end, or would just happen once. The aspects are on every verb, including in phrases with multiple verbs. For example, the sentence, I want to go out, can have two different translations in Russian. Since the want part of the sentence is an ongoing thing, the verb for want, хотеть, is imperfect in both sentences, хочу. However, we can change the go out verb for the aspect. If I want to be going out all the time, then the sentence would be хочу выходить. But if I want to go out on one specific occasion, then I'd say хочу выйти, changing the aspect of the verb where it matters. Now, it's not like the two versions of a verb are wildly different from each other. For many verbs, the perfective is just the imperfective verb with the prefix po, for example, pomnich and papomnich. Other prefixes can also be used, like s or za, like lamach and slamach, or хотеть and zhachich. Other verbs change their infinitive suffix, like nirgach and nirnuch, удалять and удалить, or бросать to бросить. Other verbs change on the inside, like выбирать and выбрать, or забивать and забыть. You can also use some patterns that come up a lot due to bound bases, like how for any imperfective verb with немать at the end, it's safe to assume that the perfective will end in nyach, like принимать to принять. Other than the patterns, there are also a few suppleted aspect pairs like lavich and paimach, and a few verbs, mainly ending in avach, that don't have two forms, like atakovach. Now beyond aspect, I've just given away some of the infinitive endings of Russian verbs, though not all. Most verbs end in ch. The letter before that can be any vowel, though ach and ich are by far the most common, and any verb ending in uch is automatically nuch. There can also be verbs ending in sh, like klash and yish. There are also a few verbs that end in sti, like visti, nisti, and rasti. Go, ichi can also belong to this group. There are also a few infinitive verbs ending in ch, like moch, vypich, and privgech. In addition to the normal suffixes, verbs can also add on sha, the reflexive morpheme. For example, поднимать means lift, but with the suffix подниматься means go up. The reflexive ending stays on the verb as it gets conjugated, but if a conjugated form, or the infinitive, ends with a vowel, then the suffix becomes sh. Speaking of conjugating verbs, let's do some of it. I'll try to hit all the main points, although I can't just put every verb into this video. For example, in the present tense, alterations on the last consonant of the root are common, specifically in the first person singular form. In order to try and touch all the bases on verb conjugations, the verbs I will use are поднимать, подниматься, поднять, нырять, смотреть, говорить, любить, открыть, бороться, прыгнуть, мочь, вести idти, and есть. Now let's talk about the non-past tense. The reason it has this name is because its meaning changes depending on which aspect the verb is. If the verb is imperfective, then this is the present tense. However, if the verb is perfective, then this is the perfective future tense, meaning that something will happen one time in the future. Now for the first verb, this is definitely the easiest category to conjugate. As y'all can see, with all non-past verbs, the verbs are conjugated for person and number. Now I'll add the sha suffix and notice how it changes when the word it's on ends with a vowel. Now here's the perfective counterpart, which I'm just putting in to show that this particular root, nyach, can behave very weirdly. Now here's a different verb to show that otherwise ach and yach are more or less the same. Now here's the yich verb, slightly different. Now for an ich verb, which is not much different from the yich verb, but now here's a different one, ljubich, which has an extra letter at the end of the root. This is just one of the stem changes that Russian verbs have, and this one is because the last sound of the root is labial. Now here's the ich verb, which evidently changes to o in the non-past, and now here's the only verb I know that ends with och, which happens to have the reflexive ending, just deal with it. Interestingly, it doesn't have the o in its non-past suffixes, unlike the ich verbs. Now here's the noch verb, which, isn't that strange? Now for verbs that don't end with ch, they all behave somewhat similarly with a consonant just before their suffixes. Now, since I mentioned the perfective future tense, I have to show how to make the imperfective future tense, which means that something will be ongoing or habitual in the future. It's an easy isolating construction, just say the personal appropriate form of być, followed by the infinitive verb. By the way, about być, Russian is a present tense copula deleting language. Now it's the past tense. Both aspects can be used in the past tense. The imperfective past indicates something that was habitual or ongoing in the past, while the perfective past is about stuff that happened once in the past, although y'all have probably deduced that by now. Past tense verbs have the inflectional categories of adjectives, by the way, which means there are only 4, masculine, feminine, neuter, and plural, and that this tense generally requires the subject. For any verb ending with ch, forming the past is very easy. Simply remove the ch, add le, and then add the appropriate vowel suffix for the noun agreement, which is nothing for masculine, a for feminine, o for neuter, and e for plural. If there's a reflexive suffix, it follows the same rules as in the present. For the other verbs, it can get tricky, although the same basic rules are followed. Some of them don't even have their masculine forms ending with le, like moch. A super weird one that must be pointed out is itchi, as its past tense form is suppleted, and it's super common. From the past tense, you can also form the mood that is either the subjunctive or the conditional. Basically, I'd say it's any irrealis mood. To form that, you just put be before or after the past tense verb. Next up, the imperative mood. There are 2 inflections here, one for singular and one for plural. The singular forms all look something like this, with i, ikratke, or mягкий знак. The plural forms are basically just the singular with che on the end. Those are all the conjugations. In order to negate any verb, put nye before it. Now a bit more about the verbs of motion, but not their effects on nouns, just the verbs themselves. Among the more important points is the fact that there are 4 distinct word pairs for go. Ichi means go by foot in one direction, while chajich is also on foot but not in one direction, while yechich describes vehicle travel in one direction, and yezdich also indicates that you're in a vehicle but allows for a return trip. The verbs of motion also make full use of derivative prefixes to describe more about the motion, like in, out, over, etc. Not to be confused, nechadich naichi looks like it would mean go on, but it actually means find. Russian also has plenty dative impersonal expressions. These are set expressions, normally about emotions, that have a dative case experiencer and a third-person verb or adverb. For one thing, there's I like it, мне нравится, and then a bunch of others like these. Remember back when I said Russian has no articles? Yeah, but demonstratives still exist. They go in front of the noun phrase and inflect similarly to the adjectives and very similarly to each other. Here are the words for this and these, and now here are the words for that and those, which you'll notice are like the other ones but without the e. Russian also confusingly has 2 words for and, which are e and a. The difference between them is whether there's a contrast being made. For example, in the sentence «У моей семьи красная машина и синяя машина», there's no contrast being made between the 2 cars, whereas in the sentence «Небо голубое, облака белые», there's a contrast. A trick to this is that if you can easily replace and with but, then say a, but if this would be completely illogical, then you have to say e. Honestly, the hardest part of Russian is the stress. I've talked about this already, but the biggest complication of stress is that it isn't even always consistent across inflected forms. Take slova, which becomes slava in the plural, but vino becomes vina in the plural. Complete opposites. This can also happen with verbs like how panyach becomes ponyal in the past. My advice, if you don't feel like memorizing every single inflected form, just do a lot of listening practice. Hopefully over time you'll come across the stress you need. Now, finally, we'll see some example sentences. First up, он изучает международные отношения в университете. Fairly simple sentence means he studies international relations in college. I decided to leave in the subject for clarity, although you could just not have it. Изучает is the third-person singular present conjugation of the imperfective verb изучать. Now, I chose the subject that this person studies for a specific reason. One thing about Russian that many people know and fear is the presence of long words, so I'm gonna chop up this phrase and show its component parts so that it's less scary. Международные means international in accusative plural, or nominative for that matter. Между is a preposition meaning between. Народный means national, but it also has words inside it. Na means on. Rod is a word meaning origin, and it's inside of many other words with similar things like родной, родитель, родиться, and родина. Ny is just an adjectival suffix. Next, отношения means relations and is also an accusative plural. It's a verbal noun coming from относить, meaning relate, and enye, the verbal noun derivative suffix. От is a prefix meaning from, by, or on behalf of, while носить on its own means carry. Moving on, v means in, although it's a bit more complicated than that, and университет, a masculine noun, means college or university, here inflected for prepositional case. The other example sentence is Совы приземлились на снежную траву рядом с нашими домами. This means the owls landed on snowy grass next to our houses. First up, совы is the nominative plural inflection of сова, which, as you can see, has different stress in each of the forms. Приземлились is the past tense plural conjugation of приземлиться, a perfective verb. Then the next phrase with na will be accusative since this is the destination of a verb of motion. Therefore, снежную траву. Снежный is an adjective and трава is a feminine noun. Then рядом с is a preposition which governs instrumental case, so that's the case that our houses, нашими домами, is in. After all that, русский самый сложный язык, который я когда-либо изучал. У этого языка есть многие окончания во всем части речи. Есть классная редукция, 3 грамматического рода, 6 существительных падежей, прилагательные, которые согласны на всем с их существительным, если атрибутивные только с родом, хотя другие, если предикативны. И глаголы с 2 аспектами и с всеми теми спряжениями, все когда мобильные ударения запутают студента везде. Однако этот язык помогал мне соединяться с моими лучшими друзьями, поэтому как минимум для меня целесообразен. Может быть, тоже для вас целесообразен, кто знает. Я рад, что вы посмотрели и, возможно, тоже получили головную боль. Поставьте лайк, если вам нравилось бы, и подписывайтесь, чтобы уведомляться о новых видео. Большое спасибо за просмотр.